And it was not until I got to library school that I realized that not everybody had the same experience with it, and that it actually creeped out quite a few people.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Kareen from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
And welcome to Keep It Fictional, the book podcast from the Port Moody Public Library. I am your host, Allison, and I am joined here by my book friends, Virginia, Sadie, Fiona, and Kareen. So today's theme is Pride Month. We're very excited to be here talking about books that fit this theme. And I think our first reader will be Virginia. Virginia, what have you got for us this week?
Thank you, Allison. Well, like you said, there are many wonderful books we can talk about for this particular episode. So I hesitated a little bit about the book that I chose because the library doesn't have it. But it's also one of my only 2 5-star reads this year. So I feel like I've been very picky this year. And so I thought it deserves more love and more people to read it, especially since the book is from a smaller indie publisher. Reading this book gives you the same kind of, I'm assuming, emotional impact as one would get, I imagine, and it's just hearsay, not experience, as what you would get when you read poetry, I think. Because it is one of those books where you have a feeling, a thought, an observation that is so perfectly encapsulated in the sentences that you can't imagine that it being talked about any other way other than those combination of words that you have in front of you. And that's how I feel about this book. I highlighted the heck out of this book on my ebook copy, obviously, because I'm not a monster. And how many of these lines really should be embroidered somewhere. And to the point where I want to restart the book all over again just so I can experience the words all over again constantly throughout this book, even though I'm supposed to be moving ahead, not backwards. But that's how I feel. So it's quite a book. And despite that, it being only 140 pages or so, it took me quite a while to go through because there was just so many things for me to sit with and just savor. And this amazing book is called An Archive of Brightness and is by debut author Kelsey Socha and is published by Lanternfish Press. I need to thank another author, actually, for drawing my attention to this book, K.A. Dorr, who is a fantasy author, which I believe we have her series in the library. She puts out different lists every now and then. So from her 2022 queer adult science fiction and fantasy book list, she put this book on the list. And thank goodness that I came across the list and the book. And it was her description that drew me into this book. Now, I have spent so much time talking about how much I love the book instead of telling you about what the book is, because it's a little deliberate, because there's certain elements, I think, in this book that may be a deal breaker for some readers. So I just want to at least have a chance to talk about the book and tell you what it's called and how amazing it is before I go into the actual story. So the Archive of Brightness is a collection that the narrators of the book are building. And it is a way for them to save, to preserve those moments that they call moments of brightness so that they don't become ephemeral, so that they don't get lost. And incidentally, this author actually wrote this book while she was studying to be a librarian. So she has got cataloging on her mind, she said. And so that's why she kind of came up with this idea of an archive. Anyway, so unlike other museums that often collect historic events, big things, big adventures that happened, this archive is full of a different kind of moments. They are often very small, maybe even imperceptible to those that are happening to even. And it's often just a small look of recognition, maybe a look of understanding, usually just something on the cusp of change. Something is blossoming, something is disintegrating. It's moments of a beginning, moments of an end. And even though to the world, these seems like very insignificant, but for the people that are involved, if they are paying attention, these are explosive moments of brightness that really should be remembered, should be observed because they are transformative. And that's what this book does. It takes us through these shiny, bright moments. And we go from story to story and we alternate and circulate back. So it's a non-linear kind of narrative, which I love. We go to Maine and we meet two lobster men. And when I first saw that on the description from K.A. Door's list, I was like, oh, half lobster, half man. That's what I was thinking of. And I'm like, no, that's like absolutely nothing like that. Lobster man is like fishermen. They catch lobsters. They don't catch fish. They're not hybrid, weird man lobster creatures. But that's what I was hoping for. But anyway, so slightly disappointed that these were just regular human beings. But anyway, we have Paul and we have Tom, and they are going out on a boat to go from trap to see if they have caught any lobsters. Paul is deeply in love with Tom, and he's waiting for Tom to figure it out. But unfortunately, a lot of things can't really happen on the mainland when there are people around. But maybe, just maybe, something can happen while they're out on a boat. Then we go to a research facility in Antarctica. And when we think research facilities, we often think like scientists, but there are also other kind of auxiliary staff that works there. And we meet an assistant chef who also double duty as the person who does all the laundry for the scientists. She has fallen for Lena, the scientist. And she decided one day, after washing Lena's lab coat, she's going to embroider teeny tiny hearts on the lab coat. It looks just like dirt or like stains or specks of like, something that is left behind that you couldn't wash off. But they're actually embroidered teeny tiny hearts, but not like the hearts that we know, but anatomically correct hearts. And so one day, Lena was putting her lab coat on and she felt this bump on the fabric. And so when she looked closer, she saw these tiny hearts and she's wondering where they came from. Then we go to a desert town where everything is made out of scorpion shells because there's no other building materials. The houses are built from scorpion shells, or the equipment or the tools they use, even the coffee maker is made from scorpion shell. And we meet a unnamed character whom we call the house builder. And the house builder lives in this desert town and she's dreaming of a future. She's thinking what her future would be like. And she imagined that she's going to meet a man who loves coffee. And this man who loves coffee is going to come to town. They're going to fall in love. They're going to get married and they're going to live in a house made from scorpion shell. But instead, she meets a woman who doesn't like coffee at all. And this woman who doesn't like coffee is nothing like what she imagined her future to be. But yet, this is the person that is going to insert her life into hers. We also meet a woman who has taken a vow of silence. She and her friends went to a party one day and somehow everybody else got poisoned and they got changed into a flock of geese. Her friends came to visit her every day, and each day there is a brief moment of time where they turn back into humans. But because they've been geese for so long for the day, by the time they figure out their human legs and human arms and how to make them work, they change back to geese. And so she's trying to figure out how to try to help her friends to transform back. So this might sound familiar because it's a little bit of a retelling of the Seven Swan story. So these are the kinds of moments that you will find in the Archive of Brightness. And this archive and all these moments are what a murder of crows is diligently building. And yes, this is a story from crows' point of view. And we hope that the crows would also notice that they too may have a moment of their own that is worth putting into this archive. Of course, the crows don't work alone. They have help from the penguins in Antarctica or the vulture who lives in the desert, who sends letters to describe what's happening in the desert. And the letters are always full of sand because there's so much sand in the desert, which I love so much. Lots of birds made an appearance in this book, including sometimes inside people in the chest that are fluttering and that are longing to burst out. So as you can imagine, this is a book that is quieter. In the past few episodes, I think we talk a lot about the types of readers that we are. I remember Corinne talking about how she's more like a plot person and that characters can fade into the back if the plot is good. And I can totally see that because Corinne is such an analytical and very logical person. As long as things make sense from A to B to C, then she can go with it. And then Sadie talks about how much she cannot deal with books that don't move along. So there's certain types of fiction that she's not a big fan of. And she wants just the story to something to happen. This is like completely, this Archive of Brightness is the complete opposite of all those books. It is very quiet, but it's also very, I feel like, very emotionally charged. And it really does sort of engage, I think, with you emotionally, but also intellectually, because there's just so many of these observations that the author slip in that just feel so right and so dead on. And it makes me realize how much I actually do enjoy books that are like about something that are kind of boring, like, things that are just very mundane that you would never think anything of it because it's not exciting. But I do actually really, really enjoy those kind of books. And I think it really reminds us to pay attention to those tiny little moments that should be very precious to us because it is, like they said, a beginning of something, the end of something. So yeah, I love this book. And I'll leave you with one of the lines from the book. It said, everything is quiet, but it's the sort of quiet that's breathing. You can't count on this sort of quiet. It might jump out at you in the dark. So this is The Archive of Brightness by Kelsey Socha.
Thank you so much, Virginia. That sounds like something I would love to read, and I may have to pick it up in the next little while. So next, I think we're going to have Corinne talk about her book.
In an analytical manner. And in fact, I do have some critiques of the construction. So for me, this is one of the most iconic images that television has ever presented to us. A drag queen in a beautiful, silky red wig that kind of goes down to the shoulders, and these beautiful long gloves right up to the elbow, lip syncing her heart out. One could even say lip syncing for her life. As when the song reaches a climax, she reaches for the fingers of the glove, whips them off in one fluid motion, and out spills rose petals. As she does the other to the hand, you think that the song has finally reached the climax. The performance is finally there. When she reaches for her wig, pulls it off, and rose petals spill down her crying face. This is Sasha Velour. Arguably by me, one of the best drag queens on RuPaul's Drag Race who has ever competed. She is a gender fluid drag queen, an editor. This might be of interest to you, Fiona, a cartoonist, which I didn't know, and an artist, and the winner of season 9 of RuPaul's Drag Race. Now, this is her first book. It is called The Big Reveal, an illustrated manifesto of drag. And it is not the book that you think it is going to be. Oftentimes when a celebrity does a memoir or a tell-all, it's all about kind of like the juicy behind-the-scenes details or their rags to riches story. But as with any challenge that Sasha Velour is given, she takes it and transforms it into art and takes it as an opportunity to educate people in the history of queerness that many people have forgotten or pushed aside. This is not only just Sasha Velour's thoughts about what drag can be, it's also a history of queerness and a history of drag, often taking the chance to highlight the roots of drag in a non-colonial lens, which I think she does a really good job at, in saying that this idea of this binary, of the idea of man and woman, is a colonial construct. And for many places and many countries and many cultures, that's really not the case. And so I really appreciated taking this platform to kind of make us dig a little bit deeper into the roots of drag, that it isn't just a form of entertainment. It can be a religious experience. It can be a cultural expression. And that looking at it through just a Western lens kind of does disservice to the entire concept. Sasha Velour really believes that drag is about transformation, both of the self and the ideas of gender, and also about revolution in a pretty big and strong way, which I like. I really enjoyed one of the quotes: "Drag is the art of bringing queer possibility to life." And with this lens, she takes a look at different facets of drag through that kind of historical and personal lens. So she looks at the history of drag in different countries and different cultures, the history of queerness, why they're called drag queens, this idea of how royalty and queerness can intersect. She looks at costumes. What is it when a drag queen wears an outfit? Is it fashion or is it a costume? And even looking at the cost of fashion itself, one of the most interesting parts of the book are kind of when she talks about her family history of her grandmother, who was a Jewish immigrant who came to the States, who, due to, depending on your interpretation of family lore, who stopped for a pickle because she really liked dill pickles or was window shopping, narrowly escaped being burned to death in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. But she also critiques fashion in the way that it exploits and often shadows the people who are making it. It talks about the idea of art versus camp and how the Met Ball's theme of camp really did not get it together and was a disservice to the entire idea. And everyone, give or take about 15 people, should be really ashamed of themselves. Talks about the idea of drag and revolution, that drag should be a challenge. Drag should challenge people. It's a performance and then it's so much more. And again, the importance of when you have a platform to use it for the betterment of all of the community. And what I like about her is that she says, I didn't always do that. I didn't always provide a space for people. I didn't always think of the betterment of my community because it's hard. And sometimes you do need to be called out and challenged. And that's part of what drag is there, is to question the status quo, both within society and within yourself, which I think is kind of wonderfully brave and self-aware. So if you're looking for a book that both celebrates and criticizes at the same time in a way that is so well thought out and both wonderfully personal and kind of like a broad overview, I really can't recommend this book enough. It's really not like any of the celebrity biographies that I've ever read, because they're really taking this chance to be like, hey, did you know that in like the 1880s there were Black queer balls? No, I didn't. And I wish you spent 15 pages on it, which comes to my criticism of the book, in that it has these wonderful little snippets of people's lives and people's history. And I'm like, give me all of that. Give me a wonderful like coffee table book of all of these wonderful people that you're mentioning, because I could read about them forever. And I would love to read more about them. And I think that, if you're coming to this as just maybe like a fan of RuPaul's Drag Race and you don't know that much about queer history, again, this is a wonderful, wonderful artist who's kind of taking your hand and say, let's go take a look. Come on. The only big critique I have of the book is that it needs footnotes. It needs footnotes and citations. And I will admit that is the pedantic side of me it was driving me insane the entire book. But if you are interested in drag, if you've watched RuPaul's Drag Race and there are questions about it, or you don't kind of know how you feel about it, I think that this book is a wonderful window into that, done by someone who's doing kind of like fantastic work within the community and fantastic work as an artist, especially right now when in the United States, there are concerted and organized efforts to kind of ban drag performances, attacking this as clearly a space of revolution and a space of questioning gender and questioning the status quo. I believe there are 14 states currently that are looking at banning drag performances in what they call public spaces under the guise of protecting the children. So I think that it's really important to kind of dig into that queer history, dig into the reality that it has always been about queer people and Black people and Indigenous people and people of color and trans people as well. That's where the attack is really going. I think that this book does a wonderful reveal of picking all of that apart. So if you're looking for something for Pride Month that gives you a little bit of history, a little bit of entertainment, and a lot to chew on, I would definitely recommend The Big Reveal by Sasha Velour.
Thank you so much, Corrine. That sounds like a fantastic read. And you're making me, a person who has never watched RuPaul's Drag Race, want to watch RuPaul's Drag Race. So next, I think we're going to go to Fiona and see what Fiona has brought us this week for Pride Month.
Thank you, Allison. I am just like thrumming with excitement, so I'm going to try to focus, but I love this episode. I just want to stay in this bubble forever, but it would also exhaust me. Okay. So today I've actually chosen a photojournalism book, which is not something that I usually do, but it's a form that I love, like Humans of New York style, where you get a beautiful portrait and then you get somebody's story from their own voice. It's just such a fascinating way to learn about people, and I love it so much. So I have chosen Delhi Communities of Belonging by Sunil Gupta and Charan Singh. And I know this is part of a bigger series, but this is the kind of the print edition. And I'm really glad that I found it and got a hold of it because I learned a lot and was really moved by it. As Karine mentioned, we're looking at a lot of anti-drag legislation right now, and in general in Canada as well, a lot of just anti-LGBTQ legislation. And this is about India, of course, and it's interesting because it surrounds the time of the anti-sodomy laws. So in 2009, the anti-sodomy law was repealed, and then it was reinstated in 2013. And then this was written in 2016 to kind of look at queer people's experience post the anti-sodomy law, which is Section 377. And the great thing about this is that since then, it has been repealed again. So that's a nice thing to read these experiences and hear how it has affected people's lives and know that that's no longer there. But I also wanted to read it from the lens of, I think at this year, at this point in time, you would really have to have your head in a hole to say like, oh, what's the big deal? LGBTQ people are safe. But last year, people said that. People say that all the time. And I don't think that they always understand like the wider world view of it, not to mention the homophobia and transphobia that happens in North America, but also that many places are facing laws that criminalize them. Right now in Indonesia and Uganda, they're facing some pretty serious legislation that could really ruin people's lives. Reading this with that awareness was very interesting. It is about 10 or 13 different bios. And I think what it did amazingly was it just gave you such a depth of LGBTQ life in Delhi, in one city. And so there were gay men, there were lesbian women, there were ones that focused on couples specifically. There were bios about trans feminine people, and all sorts of other identities. Like I said, I really appreciated that they interviewed some couples, they interviewed some people who were coupled, and then some people who are not coupled, and really saw that span of what it means to be queer in a relationship and out of a relationship. You may have heard of the identity Hijra in India. That is often considered the third sex. And from a Western perspective, it would be more comparable to a trans woman or even a drag queen. And it does contain bios about Hijra women, but it also doesn't stop at that. So I really appreciated that recognition of all of these different identities that people live. It also talks about sort of like traditional family life and the way that people do and don't fit into that. Men who are still married to women who have come out and their families say like, okay, well, that's fine. You do you, but like, you still have to take care of your children and be married to your wife, versus people who have been excommunicated from their families. And this myriad of different experiences, we can forget about that in our own country, but looking at something with all of these different stories really makes it so much more nuanced. And of course, recognizing, I think it was Karine who was talking about the colonial aspect of homophobia and transphobia, and recognizing that there are both nuances of a different culture here, but there's also the effects of colonialism on the experience of queer people in India. It does a great job going across different social economic groups. So some of people are from wealthier families and some of them are actually servants. And then again, within that, you have a huge range of whether people are out or not and just their different responses to their queer identity. It's a very matter of fact about cruising, which I found quite interesting because I think it draws to light the danger around society not accepting queer people. Then they put themselves in dangerous situations to connect with their communities. And that is something that I really felt from this book was these connections that people are making or working to make with their community, and that they have to do that in a dangerous way. They have to do that in a way that sometimes turns their back on their family. And those are the choices that they're given. And so while this was written before the repeal of Section 377, just as I think about it afterwards, and it's so great that that got repealed, but recognizing that a society is not going to just change overnight because a law changes overnight. And having gone to Delhi and seeing people's response to Hijra and the quietness around LGBTQ people, the way things are still not talked about, it just gave me so much to think about on top of having all of these really nuanced, beautiful, beautiful portraits of people, the way they see themselves as queer people, from academics to servants to politicians, and the changes that they are working to make for people on the ground, for people in their community. So if you don't pick up Delhi Communities of Belonging, I do encourage you to pick up in general photo essays about queer people. I think it's a really, really excellent touching point. The San Francisco Museum actually has an exhibit right now that is in their airport that is about elder trans people, which was absolutely amazing and brought me to tears. But that combination of photo and then someone's own expression of their identity, I think is just such a beautiful way to get to know people and the vastness of human identity. I hope you will seek a book out like this as well, and maybe of a place of interest to you, because of course there are queer people everywhere.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That is a fantastic sounding book and sounds truly fascinating. Speaking of getting to know people, I think we're going to segue into our existential question of the episode. So today's existential question is a little bit lighter, and I'm wondering what everyone's favorite book that they were read to as a child by their parents was. So for me, I would have to say when I was very young, my dad read to me The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And that was just such a formative experience for me, getting to night after night follow the adventures of Bilbo and the dwarves, crossing the forest into the land of the dragon. And it was just such a fantastic way to get introduced to J.R.R. Tolkien and to fantasy in general. And I think it has had a huge impact on the way I read.
I have two, actually. One is possibly controversial. We'll see. I'll talk about the other one first. So one that my dad used to read to both me and my sister is The Secret World of Og by Pierre Berton. It is a story about a group of children who chase after their little baby brother who has disappeared from their playhouse. They go under the floorboards of their playhouse into a land called, or I don't know if it's called Og, but it is inhabited by little green people who only say Og. I loved it. I don't know why I loved it, but I absolutely loved it. I bought a copy for myself when I was in my early 20s because I don't know if where my parents had it. I don't think they had a copy anymore. So I bought a copy. So now I own it. Now, the slightly controversial one is Love You Forever by Robert Munsch. Now, this is something that I have loved my entire life. And it was not until I got to library school that I realized that not everybody had the same experience with it, and that it actually creeped out quite a few people. But I loved it. I think that it is a very touching story. I still cry when I read parts of it. So my mom used to read that one and used to sing the song to me whenever she would read it. So that is one that has a very, very special place.
I didn't realize that was controversial because, yeah, I definitely have the same experience of, and it's still something that, my mom will say to you, love you forever, like you for always. And I have a very specific memory of her reading it to me in a doctor's office and just like crying and crying. But yes, my mom actually used to read to me a lot as a kid. And so I loved every book that she read me. I think it was a really important part of our bonding and probably why I love books, because I did not read to myself as a child. So yeah, I pretty much love everything. But I had trouble connecting with characters when I was a kid. I didn't often see myself in them. And so one book that stands out for me is Bread and Jam for Frances, about a little badger, I think. Yeah, she's a little badger. And it's like an old school book. Like it was probably even before my time. And I don't remember whether I think maybe she won't eat anything except for bread and jam. And I was like a very stubborn and picky child. So I really identified a lot with Frances. That is one that I love. I'll have to go and reread it.
Well, I've talked about this before. There are kind of no books where I grew up. Well, not just my family, but like there's just no kids' books. Like it's not a thing. So the only books that we have at home, I feel like they're like British classics. But yeah, so I have never been read to when I was a kid. So yes, so I had like nothing. Sadly.
Yeah. So yeah, my dad read a lot too. There was a lot of us, so it had to be short. It had to be really short. I remember reading a lot of him reading a lot of Aesop's fables to us, which is probably those morality tales of like good versus evil, of like learn your lesson, is probably why I like mysteries so much. But I do remember there's one where an eagle like snatches up an errant bunny who strayed too far from the burrow. And I remember feeling like this fluttering of my heart of like, the cruelty and fleeting nature of life. And that's what I really remember of being like, yeah, that's what life is. And the other one is Tatterhood by Robin Mueller. It's illustrated because when I was little, the character on the front kind of looked like me and was like a little bit of like a tomboy and had a giant wooden spoon, and they rode around on a goat and like smacked them on the head. Did I acquire a large wooden spoon as a child through garage sailing? Yeah, I did. But the real bummer is at the end, she turns into a beautiful princess and then looked nothing like me. But like the earlier, uglier version that was made by the bad flower underneath the bed, that was me. And so, yeah, that was the book that was very formative.
Did you also ride around on a goat?
If I could have, I would have. I have often looked at goats and been like, I don't think you're load bearing.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Those are all really interesting and cool looks into how reading sort of shaped your childhoods, or didn't in Virginia's case. I think next with our Pride Month books, we're going to move to Sadie. So Sadie, what have you got for us this week?
Okay, I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to start with a personal story. Now I want to take you back to the year 1999. 13-year-old Sadie is going on a trip with her family. And we are going on a month-long trip to the Eastern United States, which is where my dad is from. So we went to Boston to visit my aunt. We went to North Carolina to stay on the beach for 2 weeks with my dad's best friend from Vermont. We went to Washington, D.C. We went to Connecticut, and we went to New York. Now, this was not the first time I had been to New York, but the first time I was so young that I could not remember it. And we were not able to get a hotel in New York. We stayed in Connecticut and took the train in. We visited Pleasantville, which is where my dad grew up, and we visited New York City. Now, we only had one full day in New York City, and we wanted to go see a show. Now, what exactly possessed the ticket agent to recommend this show to a family that had two, not super young children, but probably not quite the age recommendation that this show is designed for? I'll never know. But this ticket agent recommended that we see the show Rent. We saw the show Rent, and it changed my life. It was a absolutely amazing experience. Over the next 5 or 6 years, I would go to see the show 3 more times. 2 touring casts, one in Vancouver, one in Spokane, and then once more in New York when I was traveling with my college there. And this show, it changed my life. I could not relate to a single one of the characters in it. I did not grow up in New York. I was not living in New York. I did not do drugs. I did not have AIDS. I did not struggle to make a living and fight against the man in any possible way. But something about this show just connected with me, and I absolutely adored it. Now, many, many years later, I would start following Anthony Rapp, who played the original Mark Cohen in Rent, on Instagram. And through this following of Anthony Rapp, I discovered that he wrote a memoir. And so, weirdly enough, today I am going to be talking about a memoir by Anthony Rapp called Without You, a memoir of love, loss, and the musical Rent. So this memoir, we don't have the book in the library, but we do have the audiobook on Libby. So that is how I listened to it. I think that this type of memoir really benefits from listening to the audio version of it. I know that the book includes photos, which I didn't get to see, but the audio version includes actually hearing Anthony Rapp sing some of the songs and kind of hearing the music from the show of Rent as you kind of go through it. As it says, Without You is a look at Anthony Rapp's life, starting kind of in his early 20s when he was living in New York and when he first auditioned for the show of Rent. And it kind of follows his journey through the workshop production. I think he is one of maybe only 2 cast members in the original Broadway cast who had been with the show all the way from the very beginning, from the very start of the workshop production. And so it kind of follows that. It follows the story of how Rent evolved. It follows the story of Jonathan Larson, who is the writer and creator of Rent. And it kind of shows him and Anthony Rapp's friendship and relationship through the workshop production of Rent and the connection that they had. And then the tragic death of Jonathan Larson. After the first dress rehearsal, right before Rent premiered, Jonathan Larson sadly died from an aortic aneurysm, something that was misdiagnosed, and he was sent home from the hospital and later collapsed and never woke up. So it deals with Anthony Rapp's connection to Jonathan Larson and how he responded to his death. And then the other side of this story, it deals with Anthony Rapp's mother. Anthony Rapp's mother, Mary, was a nurse her whole life. They came from a big family, and she was a very caring person. She acted as a mother for a lot of her siblings. And when Anthony was in his 20s, Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it follows the decline of Mary's health and Anthony struggling with that and trying to live his life in New York, be in a show that is now on Broadway, while also trying to be there for his family and trying to go back to Joliet, Illinois, where his family is, and be there for his mom, and none of them knowing what's going to happen, and kind of seeing the decline in her and the decline in her health. And so it kind of follows those 2 storylines. He talks a lot, as it says in the title, he talks a lot about loss, both of Jonathan and eventually of his mother. And he talks about the relationships that he has, because this is also New York City in the 90s. And it's right in the middle of the AIDS crisis. And Anthony is trying to figure out how to live as a gay man in a city where the people that he is connecting with, the people that he is dating, the people that he is friends with are dying from AIDS. And no one really knows kind of how to stop it. No one knows what to do. His mom struggles to recognize his sexuality, partially from a fear that something's going to happen to him and he is going to get AIDS and he's not going to survive. And so there's a lot of conflict between him and his mom that is resolved, but that he kind of struggles with through the whole story and into the present day. This book has now been turned into a musical, which is kind of how I first learned about it. Anthony Rapp was talking about the premiere of the musical Without You in New York. So it is premiered off Broadway in New York in just this past year in the January, I believe. Has kind of got mixed reviews. It kind of follows, again, the story, the history of Rent. Everything that I've seen him share have just been people raving about it, but obviously you're going to get both sides of it. He would probably not share the bad comments. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. I think that probably because I had such a strong connection with the musical Rent and because I had such a strong like of him already, that I really enjoyed hearing his story. I really enjoyed kind of listening to not just the progression of the show and his life in the show, but also the connections with him and his family, learning more about that and experiencing what he was experiencing during that time. Yeah. So if you are looking for a memoir that kind of touches on the late 90s as a decade, as an era, and kind of brings you to New York in that time, the life of an actor in New York at that time, sometimes successful, sometimes not. He talks about kind of the flip between when he finished the workshop production of Rent and how he had to go back to working his coffee shop job, as many actors do, unfortunately, but then kind of seeing his successes. So seeing him rise again as the show hits Broadway, and kind of, yeah, how he saw the progression of it. Yeah, I would definitely recommend either getting your hands on or listening to the audiobook of Without You by Anthony Rapp.
Controversially, Sadie, I think they should have just paid their rent.
That was not the point.
No, yes, it very much was. Just pay your rent.
I know. And I mean, as somebody who has never missed a rent payment, I get it. I do. And that's why I said I do not relate to a single person in that show. I have never, not a single person in that show can I actually, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I probably relate to the landlord more than anyone else in that show. But he will always be the villain. Taye Diggs will always kind of be a villain in my eyes because of that show. Idina Menzel will always be Maureen. It's just, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sadie. Rent was also a formative musical for me, so I may have to pick that up and learn more about Anthony Rapp's life. So for today's final book, I am going to talk about a debut novel, and we've had a lot of nonfiction this week, so I'm here to talk a little bit about fiction, and in my wheelhouse of sci-fi fantasy, specifically science fiction, I'm talking about Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh. Emily Tesh is an award-winning author of the Green Hollow duology, which starts with Silver in the Wood. She's also written some short fiction, but this is her debut novel. And Some Desperate Glory follows Valkyr, or Kyr, who is a young woman on Gaia, which is a asteroid colony of humans after humanity was almost wiped out by an attack by aliens called the Majo. Now, Kyr has spent her whole life training to fight the Majo, training to fight in this war. The slogan of these people is, "While we live, the enemy shall fear us." And that is something that Kyr has taken to heart. And she is waiting for her assignment to what she's assuming is going to be one of the combat wings of this Gaian colony. But when she finally receives her assignment, she's been assigned to nursery, which means that her job is going to be to bear children for the colony for basically the rest of her natural life. And shockingly, she is not pleased about this. She also finds out that her brother, Magnus, who also seems to be the perfect soldier, was given a combat assignment, but refused it. And this is a traitorous turn that she can't believe. She has no idea what possessed her brother, and she decides that she has to figure out what happened. And in the process, perhaps she can convince Command that they have made a mistake, that she shouldn't have been assigned to nursery, that she is more valuable as a soldier. So she finds a friend of her brother's, Avicenna, or Avi, and convinces him to help her escape Gaia and go after Magnus and figure out what's going on. In the process, they also bring along an alien, a Majo, who was captured by Gaia, and they leave and go to find what happened to Magnus. But things are not entirely as they seem, and when they leave Gaia, Kyr has to begin to confront the propaganda that she's been fed all of her life. She has to begin to confront the idea that maybe the Gaian world that she has been brought up in her whole life, maybe that worldview is not correct. Maybe the things that she's been taught aren't right. And part of this is through interacting with Majo, with aliens. Part of this is finding out about other human colonies. Part of this is finding out about Magnus and what he really wants out of life. And part of this is having to reckon with whether a tragedy that happened before she was born is something that she has to still avenge. So this is a really interesting novel. It is dark, as you might be able to tell. It really deals with ideas about autonomy and personhood and deprogramming from dangerous ideas. I found it a really interesting read. I don't think I would 5-star it. I think I probably would 4-star it. But I really enjoyed this book. And if you are a fan of space opera, if you are a fan of books that deal with the alien and the human and what it means to be human, I think that you will really like Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh. And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, book buddies, for chatting about your favorite Pride books this week. We will be back next week with more reads. And until then, see you soon.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.